Okay, so the next topic is called the tragedy of the commons. And this is a really important topic. And it has to deal with open access or common resources. So it's not a tragedy of the commons if one person or one business owns the whole resource. It only happens when we have common resources that are accessed by many different people. And what happens is that people overuse this common or open access resource, and those few people that use it get a lot of benefits, and society loses because of cost to society, external costs not taken into account. And usually, the value or even the resource itself is gradually lost over time. Sustainable use is the opposite. It's when we use resources in a way that the value is maintained through time. And so the availability of the resource is maintained into the future. So, can anybody think of resources that might be a tragedy of the commons? So, common open access resources that get degraded. All right, I'll go into my example in a second. So, probably the most common thing people think about are ocean fisheries. Nobody owns the ocean, but people take fish out of it all the time. They're large companies. They send really big ships. There's industrial fishing now. They look like factories on the water, and we'll talk more about that later. But lots of people are getting value from taking fish out of the water, but slowly the number of fish and the types of fish available for us to eat are decreasing. Some fish have been fished so extensively that they're now endangered. And the same thing happened with whaling. So many whales were taken that we had to have a commission to protect whales. So probably, in my opinion, the saddest example, and a very, very stark example, is the passenger pigeon. Now, most of you maybe haven't even heard of passenger pigeons, but originally there were thought to be 3 billion of them in the United States. European settlers cleared forests and hunted them to eat and to protect their crops. They flew in these giant crops, and you can see this illustration here, just clouds and clouds of this one species of bird. And they were so abundant that one trapper hunter was able to kill 3 million of them in 1881. And there were about 1,200 pigeon trappers in 1881. So there were enough of these passenger pigeons that it supported 1,200 people whose only job was to kill this one species. And one of those people killed 3 million of them. That tells you how many there were. In fact, there were these descriptions from the 1700s and 1800s of flocks of these birds darkening the sky and flying over for days without being able to see the sky. There were that many of these birds, and they were a huge part of eastern ecosystems back before people hunted them. There were so many of these that nobody thought it was possible to kill all of them. So people just kept killing them, and there were so many they thought it was impossible for them to go extinct. And when you get to the book Sixth Extinction, which we'll start reading after the holiday break, they will talk about how people didn't used to believe in extinction. That wasn't a scientific concept that was recognized as a real thing until relatively recently. So back then, people just thought that they couldn't go extinct. But by 1870, most of them had actually been killed, and hunting regulations were finally put into place in the 1890s, but it was too late. The last one died, and they named her. Her name was Martha. Last one died in a zoo in 1914. And so this is the ultimate tragedy of the commons. We had this amazing resource, 3 billion pigeons. People like to eat them. They were so abundant. It was something cheap that you could eat. But people, some people benefited by hunting them. And eventually there were none. They went completely extinct. The ultimate tragedy of commons, because the resource isn't available at all now. This resource wasn't just degraded, it's not available at all. And so this was a common resource available to any person that lived in the eastern United States, and some people killed so many of them that they're not available at all to the people in the United States. So I also want to go back and talk about economics. So obviously a lot of these things relate back to economics, and taking into account this value for natural resources is part of these two different disciplines called environmental economics and ecological economics. So environmental economics is a subdiscipline of traditional economics. It studies the costs and benefits of different environmental policies, and it treats natural capital and financial capital as exchangeable. So basically, if we have a forest, which has natural capital, and we have financial capital, is like money in the bank that you would get from cutting down the forest. Other financial capital might be an office building. So the basis of the natural capital value are things like the ecosystem services the ecosystem services provided, like clean drinking water, renewable resources, so we can cut down some of it and allow the rest of it to regrow. But other aspects are hard to put a monetary value on, like recreation or spiritual values. But in environmental economics, if the financial capital is greater than the value of the natural capital, the environmental economics says to cut down the forest. So basically, if we add up all the natural capital that we get from a forest, and we look at how much money we could get from cutting down the forest, if there's more money from cutting down the forest, in environmental economics, it would say to cut down the forest. That would be the better option. However, if the natural capital value is higher than the value of the timber from cutting down the trees, then it would say to preserve that forest instead of cutting it down. It's basically weighing the amount of money in these two different states that the forest could be in, cut down as timber or providing ecosystem services. Ecological economics is different. It brings together ecologists and economics, and it's interdisciplinary. It doesn't just have classical economists putting value on things and then making these cost-benefit judgments. It treats economics as a subdiscipline of ecology, and it emphasizes preserving natural capital and sustainable development. So this goes back to conservation biology being a normative discipline. Does anybody remember what normative means? Think back. It means ethical value. So it goes back to these ethical values of conservation biology, that is that the preservation of biodiversity is a good thing. So it treats converting natural capital to financial capital as a bad idea because we want to preserve these values of biodiversity into the future and make sure things are sustainable for the long term. I did want to point out that there is an environmental economics class here at Louisiana Tech. It's offered in the spring some of the time, so if you're interested in that kind of thing, this might be an interesting elective for you to take.